Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you, all of you, for joining us for this follow-up to our Summer Institute in-person trainings that we had this summer. This webinar is intended to be a sort of a catch-up on some of the things that we talked about in the summer, a review of those things, as well as expanding on some of those topics that you expressed more interest in learning more about. If you have questions during the webinar, there should be a chat icon that you can type into the chat icon there, or you can just speak out, speak up, unmute yourself, and just interrupt us. This is going to be pretty informal. We want this to be as useful a time as possible for you, so definitely don't hesitate to speak up if you have questions. Let's get started. So, like I mentioned, we'll do just a brief overview of some of the things that we discussed over the summer, just to bring everyone up to speed. And then we'll really dig into utilizing some of Project Success's resources to make sure that you and your teachers have everything that you might possibly need in order to do the things that you need to do for students every day. We'll talk a little bit about unpacking and curriculum mapping and show you some examples and just give you ideas for that. We have a few announcements just as far as other opportunities that are coming up, and then we'll talk about what would be some next steps moving forward. Can everyone hear me okay so far? Is anyone hearing me? We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep going here. You're up.
All right, well, welcome today. My name is Heidi Brett Baker, and I am part of the Project Success team. I've been on the team for about 2 years now. My past history is working in the schools in many different roles, a building administrator, as well as a district administrator. I've also taught in higher ed, and I was in the first part of my career, the first 15 years in the classroom, working as a special education teacher. I worked in with all different types of students, and I worked in both in a
year, almost coming up on my 4th year. We'll be starting my 4th year with the Project Success team. Before that, I was a special ed teacher for about 10 years, and I also had a few years in between there where I did some other things as well. But as you all know, if you've joined Project Success before, we like to show off our families. So you just got a quick glimpse into our lives there to see our families. But let's move forward here. So hopefully you all received what we are calling pre-activities. Oh, good. Okay, people can hear us now. Yay, here they come. Okay, good. So glad. So hopefully you all got these pre-activities that were really just designed to give you some additional information, sort of get your brain thinking about some of these things that we'd be talking about today. And we also had something new where we put together that scavenger hunt so you could kind of poke around on our website and maybe discover some things that you didn't know existed before. So what we want to do here just for a second is sort of learn from you, to hear from you what resources you found that you thought would be most helpful for your teachers. Is there something that would be helpful for you as the instructional leader of these teachers, and just any ideas you have moving forward about how you'll use some of the resources that you discovered through this scavenger hunt?
Or even maybe so, how would you use this scavenger hunt for maybe one of you, a new staff person, or maybe a new administrator coming on board? Again, use your chat icon to give us any suggestions or any of your thoughts.
We're going to keep an eye on that chat box. So as you have ideas or things that you want to share about the resources that you found to be useful or ways that you may use this moving forward, definitely feel free to share, and then we will share that with everyone.
So one participant says, I'm not sure that I received the pre-activities. This came out one day last week. It would have been from Ashley's email. But we also, Megan, since you didn't receive it, we can also follow up and send you it out so that you have it to look through after the webinar.
Yeah, so we're recording today's webinar. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email that'll have a link to this recording. So if you're not able to stay for the whole time or you want to make sure you share it with someone, you'll have that link. And then what we'll do is just make sure to include those pre-activities in that email as well to make sure that everyone has them. Okay, yep, we're hearing a couple people maybe didn't get them. No worries, we will make sure we get those out to you. Just to move forward real briefly, want to make sure everyone knows, I'm sure you know by now about the Indiana Resource Network. We always just like to briefly sort of shine a light on all the different resource centers that are available to you and your teachers as supports. If you go to the website listed there, or just go to the DOE's website and type IRN in the search bar, it'll bring you to a page with the names of all these resource centers and a description of what each of them does. So if there's something you're really struggling with and you want to find some additional supports, that would be sort of the #1 spot to check first, we would recommend. This is just our website to remind you and make sure that you're able to access it, projectsuccessindiana.com. Pretty much anything you'll ever need is in that resources tab up in the upper right-hand side. We'll also post this webinar recording on our resources page as well, so you'll be able to get back to it that way. And this is where it will be. Since this is a follow-up to our summer regional training, it will be located in that regional training section. I imagine we might also put it in the webinar section just to alleviate confusion. So check both places. I'm sure it'll be somewhere. All right, let's get into it. So we've been using this slide for a while now because it really encapsulates sort of the main goal of Project Success, which is to improve student outcomes. And then the way that we do that is by focusing on these sort of 3 areas, right? They're very similar, but they also have their own unique sort of pieces as well. So presuming competence in students, having high expectations for them, and then operating under the least dangerous assumption. We'll get into this more here in a little bit, but that sort of sets the stage. We found this quote and felt like it was a fitting way to think about some of the assumptions that we make as teachers, as educators, especially for our students with the most significant disabilities. So Albert Einstein himself said, assumptions are made and most assumptions are wrong. So I think it's really easy to go off course, to go off track with an assumption that's made sort of in the spur of the moment. And it is worth, I think, digging into and spending time thinking about, okay, what is it that we might be missing here? Or what could we be doing differently maybe if we don't make that assumption, if we consider some other things that may be going on as well. So that just sort of encapsulates that.
And so when we think about, in that framework, what we're building, and we're talking about the framework that we think of as Project Success and working with students with the most complex needs, the first one being that to build that framework is really thinking about what does least dangerous assumption mean? And what that means is when we don't have all the data, sometimes we have pictures of the data, we have pieces of the data, and we're thinking about making decisions. We ought to base on the assumption, which is if it's incorrect, if it would be incorrect, what would be the least dangerous effect on our students? So we should assume that they have the capability, they have the potential, and we start from that presumption that they do, and that we present them the material. And if they do not master it, we have done no harm. But if we didn't present it, then we would have done harm, and we would have caused students then to not have that instructional opportunity. So when we think about the dangers of assumptions, there's many that come to mind for us. We think about that oftentimes when we think about working with students with the most complex needs or pretty significant needs, we often come across many educators who think of things very closed-mindedly. I've seen that type of student. This is how it's going to be. They think they always have that assumption. Or oftentimes, if we, as educators, think about, we've read an IEP or we've looked at the data that was presented, and when a student is getting tested and starting to think about getting services, we automatically categorize them by their test scores or what they can do. And that causes us to label people, and then we kind of put them inside of a box, and we don't give them the opportunity to really expand. Same things, oftentimes we know that this small population of students is often very much discriminated because people have lower expectations for these students, and they don't have that we don't presume that they can learn in the gen ed setting or with their age appropriate peers. Oftentimes when we make dangerous assumptions, we lack understanding. We sometimes don't allow teachers that teach students with the most complex needs that connection with other teachers, with other gen ed teachers, other teachers in the building, to give them kind of a background for gen ed material and content. And so I think with the danger of assumption is that oftentimes we feel like we know that student automatically right away, and they fit inside this box, inside this self-contained classroom, and we really kind of box ourselves in, whereas instead of really thinking about presuming competent, where our students can really blossom and explode if just given the opportunity. So let's think about your assumptions. Let's check them and see. Here's just a couple that we want to talk about. So some false assumptions that often are presented, that accommodations are unfair advantages for students. And we really want to think about that. That is untrue for students. We know that accommodations are meant so that students kind of just have that playing field leveled. So, you know, if a student has difficulty, has low vision, has difficulty seeing, we know that by wearing glasses or given braille or large print, that is not giving them an advantage. That's giving them the same foundation to learn things, just like students who do not have a vision issue. So really thinking about, that's a false assumption when teachers think of that accommodations are unfair advantages. This is another huge one that's often happens in a self-contained classroom, and often happens with when we are thinking about teaching students with the most complex needs, that accommodating a student means lowering my standards. We certainly do not think anytime either using content connectors or using the academic Indiana standards and giving accommodations means lowering standards. We have high expectations for all students, and accommodations just is a solution to help students be able to master material and have exposure to material and access to material like their age-like peers. Also, another assumption is students will invent a disability or just to get special treatment, or students will try to work the system. We certainly do sometimes have students who become abled or enabled by having so much extra support, but oftentimes when the students that we're talking about, that is not the case. And so I think that is just a assumption, because students need to have support and different services when they have a disability. And last, another huge one where we're thinking about inclusive practices is students aren't smart enough to make it in gen ed, and students with disabilities don't belong in there in the first place. We're going to present later in this PowerPoint the research. There's been lots of research done in the last 30 years about inclusive education and how much it does benefit students with disabilities, and it does not affect students with non-disabilities or gen ed students, that it does not hinder them at all. And in fact, sometimes it leads to different kind of outcomes for students who are in the gen ed setting. And so we will talk about that a little bit more, and especially as we talk more about inclusive practices. There's a great read at the bottom that there's a link there about the least dangerous assumption. It's really thinking about outing that prejudiceness about making the least dangerous assumption.
So, excuse me, the worst thing that can happen if we say, okay, we're going to presume competence, I'm going to assume that my students can learn something from this lesson. The worst thing that can happen is that you're wrong as the educator. The student may not be able to learn the content of the lesson. And sure, you might be disappointed and maybe you put some work into the lesson and you're disappointed, but nothing disastrous will have happened from that outcome. And I would say too, that just because we don't get the response that we expect or the response that we would hope to get doesn't mean that we haven't laid the groundwork in that student to have gained some content from that lesson too. So we were just having a conversation about this the other day where at some point, if a teacher is looking for a particular response or expecting a particular outcome from a lesson, that makes the lesson more about the teacher and less about the student, right? So our job is to present the content and of course, present it in a way that is accessible as possible for all the varied needs of our students. But it's not necessarily our job to get a particular response from a student, especially when we're thinking about those students with the most significant needs. Their response methods and abilities are different. And we may not get the response that we're hoping for, but that doesn't mean, again, that we haven't laid the groundwork for them to be gaining some of that content. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. So essentially, it boils down to if you want to see competence in students, it helps if you look for it, right? And that goes right along with what we've been saying about not making assumptions, these false assumptions and things like that. Like give these students a chance to surprise you, honestly. So this is why these are 7 reasons why presuming competence is essential. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I think those of you, especially who have joined us before, you've heard me probably in particular just really hammer home why it's so important to presume competence in these students. But it doesn't hurt to say it again. So I think one of the main things that we can focus on why presuming competence is essential is it really sort of is the key starting point for our students as far as communication goes as well. We have students, who are either nonverbal or they haven't identified a mode of communication yet. That communication piece, if you start from a place of presuming competence in that student, then there's going to be more progress made as far as finding ways for that student to communicate, even if they're less traditional. So I think that's one of the big ones that we can, that we can focus in on. And then that last one that's on there, just presuming competence, it is the least dangerous assumption. When we presume competence in a student, we are doing the least harm because the consequences of presuming that competence are not as dangerous as the alternative. So
when we think about, because this is a follow-up for our administrative training, we talked some this summer about when you are charged with being an instructional leader of teachers who support students with the most complex needs, that sometimes when you're doing walkthroughs or when you're doing evaluations or when you're just trying to coach a teacher through, that what are some of the things that you should look for? What are some of the things that you could coach, help your teachers with when they're thinking about how do we presume competence? And so we listed some very simple strategies your teachers could be using when presuming competence with their students. And they look like, having age appropriate talk, that, making sure that if you're in the high school setting, that your teachers are using appropriate tone, the appropriate voice tone with their students, and they're using appropriate topics. We're not talking about Barney at the high school level. We're talking about, maybe country music or rock and roll music that's on that their age-like peers are listening to. It's thinking about supporting that communication piece. It's really essential when we get to any level for students, but especially at the high school level, that we've gotten students to that high school level and they have some kind of communication, that we've kind of broken that barrier of communication. So that would be looking like that most students that do not have the opportunity to verbally express themselves, that they have some kind of AT device, that device is used openly all day long in the classroom, that it's very accessible for the students. It could be teaching peers, like if you have student aides or student helpers come in and other paraeducators in the classroom that you can help them when students are having difficulty or when they need extra support. So just teaching all those people that come alongside of you and help support in the classroom to help them know what that framework is of having presumed competence and what that looks like when you're working with a student day in and day out.
This is just some additional strategies. You can read through these at your leisure, but other ways that you can know that you or someone around you is presuming competence in students. Asking permission to share information with others. I think that's one that we don't think about a lot, but it kind of goes actually with the one that I think was the last one, the last bullet on the last slide about not speaking as though the student isn't there, you know, speaking in front of them as if they're not there and things like that. Like these students are people and deserve to be treated as such, regardless of, you know, the disability that they have. So, and sometimes I think we get to be preaching to the choir a little bit. So, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that anyone on this call doesn't think that, you know, that you're not presuming competence in your students, but it's so important that we carry that torch almost to be spreading it, you know, amongst the teachers that we work with as well, right? It's not enough for us personally to believe it. We also have to make sure it's spreading throughout our districts. So the designing modifications and accommodations, that is one of the critical ways that we can be presuming competence. I've been doing a lot of work, and hopefully we'll be ready to share this shortly in a different presentation, but I've been doing a lot of work looking at why is it that we can expect students with significant needs to be participating in the gen ed curriculum, because that's what the law says, right? That students with disabilities should be participating in and making progress in the general curriculum. And I think on the surface, a lot of times we get hung up thinking, but hold on, wait a minute, they have this significant disability. That means they can't, or it's too hard for them to do that, or whatever. So that bullet about designing modifications and accommodations, that is really where we're going to focus a lot of our time as educators of these students. We don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel with curriculum or with the academics that are going on already, but what we do need to find are those specific ways in which we can modify the curriculum or use an alternative strategy or accommodation or whatever. Oftentimes it's going to be many of those things in combination to really sort of unlock the curriculum and the content for those students with more significant needs.
I think the key word there is access, right? Because we're talking about accessing the curriculum. We're not talking about mastering the curriculum. And there's going to be a slide coming up in this webinar to talk about a little bit about the difference between accessing the curriculum and mastering it. And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, and it may seem like a small difference just in words, but it's a huge difference in terms of how that plays out. Yeah, the work that is done in classrooms. So good point. All right, Heidi sort of mentioned this already, but you know, especially within the last 30 years or so, there's been a ton of research going on that honestly, it shows that when students with disabilities are educated with their non-disabled peers, and even students with disabilities with a variety of disabilities, right? When everyone is learning together, they experience better outcomes sort of across the board, academically, behaviorally, even graduation rates and things like that. That is not to say that we're bringing everyone together and treating everyone the same and applying a one-size-fits-all sort of thing, because that's not the answer either, right? But there is something to be said for having students together, students with disabilities and their non-disabled peers as much as possible. And then, like we've been saying, applying those modifications, accommodation strategies and all of that to individualize or differentiate. But there is something really powerful about having students together in those outcomes that come from that. Well, I won't go into this in any great detail, but it's worth sort of exploring maybe later if you want to look into it a little bit more. But the point of this slide really is to show the power of expectations when we have higher expectations for students with disabilities. I'll see if I can turn this into a short version of this story. But in Kansas, students with disabilities, there was a time where they were not included in the state assessment, and then that was in 2000. And then between then and 2003, they were included in the state assessment. And so these bars show the percentage of students who were proficient in reading and math in both of those years. And you can see that the numbers jumped quite a bit from before students were included in the state assessment and after the students were included in the state assessment. And I always joke and I say, wow, that must be some amazing assessments just because they were included on the assessment. Now so many more students are proficient in reading and math. Of course, that's not the assessment though, right? It's the fact that one, students themselves sort of knew and understood like, oh, I have these higher expectations. I'm going to be taking this assessment. I better, pay attention and try hard and all these things. But more than that, the teachers themselves had the expectation of, oh my goodness, my students will be participating in this assessment. I should make sure that I'm teaching them the content that is going to be on this assessment. And when they presumed that the students would be able to learn that content, and when they put it out in front of them, you can see these huge jumps. The proficiency in reading almost doubled, and they're not doing anything different other than just having higher expectations. Now, that's not going to be the magic fix for every single student, but I think it's powerful, and goes back to our original point about making assumptions. You can't just assume that because a student has a particular disability that they're incapable of certain things. You have to try. You have to at least try, and this is a good sort of snapshot of what happens when we just try.
And just following through, this is just showing you more about the power of expectations too. So I've talked kind of throughout this whole webinar about the research, and there's a lot of research out there, like that slide said a couple of minutes ago, about the last 30 years about inclusive practice, and thinking about does it change a school day for students with disabilities? Does it change a school day for people without disabilities? And if you look at the SWIFT site and this research here that I have, it takes about 43 different research projects that have really looked into inclusive practice and showed that the power expectation, students with disabilities who spend more time in the school day in inclusive setting always score higher on their tests, both in language and math. And this one in particular is in the language area, where if they spend the majority of their school day in an inclusive setting, are exposed to the general curriculum, that they score higher than those who do not.
I think the important point to be made there is just if the access to the content and curriculum is the first point, right? If they don't have access, then they for sure can't teach themselves the content, right? So we have to at least put the content out there. And if it can be in the gen ed setting with their non-disabled peers, so much the better, right? But of course, there's always going to be circumstances where it's best for the student to be in a different setting, and that's fine. No one is saying 100%, right. Because there is still the continuum of services and all of that. We're not negating that by any means, but it is pretty powerful to see how outcomes can be improved and increased when students are together with their peers. So this is just sort of a quote that summarizes a lot of that, and is a good way, I think, to broach the subject with teachers who may be a little more hesitant about this whole idea of having high expectations for students. It doesn't mean that we're just, throwing them to the wolves and saying good luck, but it does mean that we think students are capable and that we are willing to put in the work to help them sort of reach those capabilities, right? If we can find the right services and supports and the things that work for that student. That does take a lot of work. No one is saying that just, when you flip the switch of having high expectations that everything is sunshine and roses and it all works out beautifully. There's still a lot of work that goes into it. That's why we're here. Project Success is here to help you find those services and supports and strategies and all of that. But it is something that can be done. And so we really are trying to turn it both for students and for teachers from I can't do it into I can do it. This just goes to show, again, how this sort of, how this aligns with the graphic over on the right side, how it aligns with ESSA, this idea of we're just trying to provide equity to students, and access is a huge part of that. We want them to have equitable access. And then again, that comes to improving and increasing outcomes for students. So even our own Office of Special Education believes that, students should be held to these high expectations and have that equitable access. We're not just trying to hammer and drill in these academic standards into these students. We're doing it because we have this research background that shows when we present the content and work to make content more accessible to students, it improves their outcomes overall.
Yeah, so when we think about special education, we really need to think of it as a framework. It's a framework that we customize support so that students can have education plans that are achievable. Just some things on here to be thinking about, just to kind of when you hear the word special education, we need to think about that. That doesn't mean it's a code for self-contained. It just means special education is our services. And we need to be thinking about placement versus location when we think about special education. And we need to be thinking about that it is under IDEA so that every student is afforded FAPE, that they are a student first, and then they have a student, then they become a student with a disability, and that IEP helps them set that framework for their plan for that year, and that those are services. It's not a placement when a student has an IEP. It should be really thinking about what are the services that are needed to complete that framework or that plan for them for the year.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's sort of what Heidi alluded to. All students are students first, period. And so they have the right to, be exposed to the gen ed content and things like that. Yes, they will require some modifications and accommodations and services and supports and all of that, but they still, at the end of the day, have the right to be exposed to that grade level content. And so now, again, going back to Heidi's point, that doesn't mean necessarily we're trying to get them to mastery of all that content, but they absolutely have the right to be exposed to it. That's what this quote is saying here about making progress in the gen ed curriculum. So the placement versus location, just because a student has, according to their disability, a significant intellectual disability or something like that, that doesn't automatically assign them to a location and vice versa. So really keeping in mind the continuum of services and all the things that you have available to you, and maybe even things you don't know you have available to you yet, trying to find that sort of perfect match of services and supports and where they can get the most benefit from their peers and from their teachers.
And I think, like Ashley said a little bit ago, it might be a little bit of play on words, but it really is thinking about what those words mean. So it's really like here in this quote, it talks about involved in general ed. Mm-hmm. And we said access general ed. Like, once again, we did not say mastery ever of the general ed curriculum. Certainly we want them to have growth and we want them to make progress. But growth and progress does not mean mastery. And so we're going to constantly talk about that it's really having access and involvement in the gen ed curriculum with a growth mindset, not necessarily mastery mindset.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that too, it's not enough to just quote unquote, get a student with a disability in an inclusive setting and say, well, there we go, they're involved in the classroom just because I kind of stuck them in the inclusive classroom. There is going to be work that needs to be done to make the content truly accessible, not just physically they're in the classroom, or have heard the content. But how can we really intellectually make that content accessible to those students so that it's a kind of a happy medium in between those two? All right, let's take a brief look at what effective instruction might look like for students with significant disabilities. So hopefully you're all familiar with the content connectors. This is just a quick review of who, what, when, where, and why we use the content connectors, and then how. So they are meant to be used for students with the most significant needs, not just any student who happens to be struggling with the Indiana academic standards. They are alternate standards, so sometimes the content connectors and hearing that term alternate standards, those are interchangeable. They come across just all over the place, right? In lesson planning, instruction, IEP goals, and of course that's how students are assessed on IAM, where we want to point out that this should be done in the least restrictive environment. So back to what we were talking about before, special ed doesn't necessarily mean self-contained classroom. Well, content connectors doesn't automatically mean self-contained classroom either. Students can be working towards content connectors in the gen ed setting, in a self-contained setting, or any combination thereof. Why do we have these content connectors? It really does stem from these having higher expectations. And then how, that's one of the things that we spend the most of our time on, is helping teachers and administrators know how to do this. How can we balance everything that needs to be done, and what does it look like to prioritize and all of that. So that's just a brief overview to remind ourselves of what's going on with content connectors. These are the ways in which we're going to sort of incorporate. We have these content connectors. Now we know that we have this idea of having higher expectations for students. How is this all going to play out? So each of these colored bubbles just is one sort of, I mean, we could go on for days probably about each one of these, but these are just things to keep in mind and maybe sort of tag for later thought. What might this look like for my district or my teachers, or how could I make this happen so that we can really be putting our high expectations into practice. So things like unpacking the content connectors, really breaking them apart into the skills that are involved. aligning to gen ed. With all this talk about how students with disabilities should be participating in gen ed as much as possible, it doesn't help if what they're doing when they are in a self-contained setting is completely out of alignment with what's going on in gen ed. So is there something we can be looking at to make sure that there's a little more of a flow or sort of a match between what's going on there? Curriculum mapping is one way that might sort of help get things in alignment that way. Of course, we're always talking about specially designed instruction. So not only do we want our students with disabilities to have access to what's going on in a gen ed setting or the gen ed curriculum, but we know by the very nature of them having disabilities that they need that specially designed instruction as well. So that's one way that we can be really sort of honing in on the high expectations that we have for them and finding ways to sort of boost those areas that require some extra support. And then universal design for learning, that can touch so many of these areas in so many different ways, but it's really about making sure that all students, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, whether they have a significant disability or not, has the opportunity to learn in a variety of ways that work best for their brain, so that they can receive content in a variety of ways, that they're able to express themselves in the content that they learn in a variety of ways, and that teachers are always looking for different ways to keep the students engaged. All of these things are ways that will help draw out having high expectations for these kiddos. Briefly talking about unpacking, there are several things that we look for when we're unpacking the content connectors. We're not going to go into that in any great detail, but this just shows we're not only thinking about the skills that are listed in the content connector, but we're also thinking about the vocabulary that's going along with that. And maybe most importantly, what's the functional application of whatever this content connector is asking students to do? We're not just trying to randomly teach them miscellaneous content. We really want to, if possible, draw a connection to how this will play out in their daily life. So there's a lot that goes into unpacking. This is what our template looks like. So hopefully many of you have seen this already if you haven't used it yourself. But it really is just breaking down a content connector into skills and concepts, and then really digging down into what we call the access skills, right? What the skills that are required for every student to master that grade level content connector. And I always point out for this, just because it says master in that sentence there doesn't mean that that's what we're expecting, but what it is meaning is that that's what we're considering, right? What are all the pieces that go into a student being able to master the grade level content connector? And then we pick from that, okay, what are the ones for this student or for this class that we really need to zone in on? So don't let that scare you that you see the word master there. But the access skills, it can be all the way down to, well, here, we'll show you an example. It can be all the way down to the very most basic ways to access curriculum, having a mode of communication. So if you're working on identifying a mode of communication with a student, that's a skill that's aligned to really any grade level content connector, because the student has to be able to communicate in order to engage in the content connector. Now, that doesn't mean that you are presenting the content listed in that content connector when you're simply working on their mode of communication, but it does mean that it's a skill that's aligned, and I think that's important to point out. And then it kind of goes all the way along from those very most basic skills all the way up to skills that are more closely aligned to the content connector. So we have a couple different examples here. This one is a little bit different from what you may have seen in some of our other examples. This particular district chose, because they had a life skills classroom that was literally K through 6 students, and that's a lot to take into consideration. So the way they unpacked was to find all the similar content connectors for number sense, K through 6, and get them all in one template, and then say, okay, what are the skills, what are the concepts, what are these access skills that we're looking at that are universal sort of across K through 6 in these number sense standards. So that's just a different way of doing it that we wanted to show you. It doesn't have to be super tied, to that first example that we showed. Here is a more secondary example. This is a 7th grade content connector, but it's the same concept, regardless of grade level, regardless of subject area, you're just breaking down as far as you can each little piece that goes into the content connectors. Heidi, is there anything you want to say?
Well, and I think that where we like to land then for teachers is to really think about those barriers. What did you identify as the access barriers for your students? And that's where you start for those IEPs, because IEP goals. That's where you want the students then to master that. That's the barriers that we want them to master or overcome them so that they can reach for higher expectations and they can reach for more knowledge at the grade level.
Or I would say too, it could be either those are the places where you're looking to sort of create your IEP goals, or those are just the areas that you're going to have, you're going to have to accommodate and modify for, right? Yep. So either or, but either way, it gives you sort of a direction to move, right? After you've gone through the entire content connector, now you have sort of some things to focus on moving forward. Here's a high school one, an algebra one. So even at this level, solving linear equations, it is possible to break it down into access skills and then find ways to reach students at really any access level. All right.
And then just so we're talking about that framework of having presumed competence and least dangerous assumption, high expectations. And that's our framework that we start thinking about for students with most significant needs. And then we build that upon how do we do that? We're using content connectors, we're unpacking them. And then once you've thought about the content connectors, unpack them, it's really aligning it to the curriculum, the gen ed curriculum. And we do that through curriculum using work plans. And I think Ashley alluded to this a little bit ago. That's such an important step in process for teachers, so that we do have many students that are in a self-contained classroom, and they do, our intent, the intent is to expose or give students access to the gen ed curriculum or involve them in the gen ed curriculum. So one way to do that is look what's happening in the gen ed setting and build those standards, then find the content connectors that match that and build out your curriculum. I think another real important reason to do this is because if you are having the expectation that you want to build your inclusive practice in your building, that students need to have an opportunity to see the gen ed curriculum and what it looks like, and be prepared what's going on in the gen ed when they start in that inclusive practice. So, if they're going to be taking biology, maybe second semester, but first semester you're working through that and you're kind of setting the pace, what's going on in the gen ed classroom, then you're going to give them a foundation and you're going to prepare them for that inclusive practice. So we've included 3 different types of work plans. This is one. This is another one where it's the content on the left, then the Indiana standard, then we align the content connector with that. We either have the objectives or I can statements, what assessments would go into that fringe vocabulary, that academic vocabulary. Sometimes people list the core vocabulary in here as well, and then what resources you're going to utilize in this content. And then work 3 is very similar, but just listed in a little bit of a different way. So there's many options that you can choose. When we're working with the district, oftentimes we say, let's start with the gen ed curriculum maps, see what format they use. You don't want to recreate the wheel. You want to use that. So if we can use that template that they've already used in their buildings and then add in the content connectors and our assessments and the vocabulary that we think students need, that's what we do. It's what works best for you for your team and for your building. But, the first step is unpacking those standards, but then the next step is moving into that curriculum mapping. So we are making sure that teachers have a work plan. We have a curriculum plan for what's going to be taught. And so that we have a systematic way that we are going to approach the content connectors and the standards to be met, just like the gen ed counterparts are.
I think that's so important. So there's really 2 sides to this, right? One is we're talking about trying to align to gen ed because of what we talked about before, but 2, just to make sure that there's some kind of systematic approach, period. I think sometimes teachers can get caught up in, well, what are we going to do today? What do you seem to need today? And there is something to be said for being flexible to meeting students' needs on a daily basis, but we also have to start off at least with a plan of where are we now? Where do we want to go? Just to make sure that we're covering all our bases. So,
and I think another point too is when you're thinking about inclusive practices, we oftentimes our teachers who teach students with most significant disabilities will say, I hate like PDs because I don't feel a part of it.
Yeah.
Well, if they were involved in a curriculum mapping and they're involved in the content, they're going to feel a part of what's going on, and they are going to learn a lot because, you know, I always think of it as the gen ed teachers. They have a subject area that they are charged with, either English, math, or, you know, a science. They would be the content experts, whereas our teachers should be, with a special education license, should be the strategies, right? You need to find that strategy, what works best. How do you accommodate best? How do you modify best? So what better than to partner so those two teachers can work together to be effective for all students using that UDL that we've been talking about early on in this webinar. So one of the things that you've taught with that in the survey that we gave this summer was what were some things that you wanted to know a little bit more about, and how does it all kind of connect together? So just thinking about that certificate of completion, and how does it all flow together? How does unpacking, curriculum mapping, and exposure versus mastery all come together?
Yes.
And I think that the one way that I always kind of talk about it with teachers is to think about the expectation is that we have mastery at skills where the students are at, where they're most closest to, and that mastery often happens in the IEP.